welcome everyone. My name is Greg Kunkel. I'm one of the co-founders here at Jump. So maybe a little bit of context. We're starting about 20 minutes late. I would like to promise we'll make up some time, but I'm not known necessarily for making up time. So I will do my best to keep to time, giving us 20 minutes later. We'll cut a little bit to what's working, what's not. And I do want to leave some time for questions at the end. So a little bit on this. So Tom and I, you can't see Tom, but Tom Fuller is my kind of talking partner, training partner, thinking partner. And Tom and I, over the last couple of years in particular, over the last probably 9 months, we've been to many Navy bases, worked with many Navy teams. So there's some familiar faces here. But before that, I think over the last year and a half, even previously, within the Air Force, for-profit companies, we've spent a lot of time looking at feedback cultures, talking about our feedback culture and how that translates, and around this kind of notion of a foundational setup for high-performing teams, feedback and coaching. So it really builds off what Charlie and Megan touched on this morning. Moving a little bit deeper into maybe some of the how, and in particular, 3 topics I'll touch on today. So how building a culture of feedback fails, where it goes wrong. And Charlie touched on some of it, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper. The second part is some of the principles of a feedback system and upgrading that. And what does that mean? And the third part is details on upgrading conversation 2, that junior to senior conversation. And I'm mindful in some cases I'll get feedback around, but what's the guidebook? What's the actual manual for doing this? And we have some, and we have them, and you can have some afterwards. But I'm going to really try to not get too lost in the details on some of this. I should have had actually, can I get the clicker? Hold on one second, I'm just getting the clicker. Should have done my pre-check. So just a reminder, this is what Charlie had. He did a nice, neat diagram on the 4 conversations around healthy feedback. And so I'm going to, in some ways, broach on all of them in this kind of healthy teams have 4 conversations around complex and difficult topics up and down the chain of command within teams versus dysfunctional teams struggle with conversation with all 4. And I should really say major struggle. All of us struggle with it. So I think we're all in a quest on how to upgrade these conversations. And so these are the ones I'm going to spend at the end a little bit more detail in terms of that conversation number 2, the junior to senior conversation. So in terms of this topic, there's so much research, news articles, publications on it. In fact, I picked one that I got sent yesterday. There were some good parts into it. I always learn more. But this is around cracking the code of sustained collaboration, an HBR article that got on a lot of the topics that we talk on. It starts, ask any leader whether his or her organization values collaboration, you'll get a resounding yes. And there were just a few, just to level set a little bit before I get into how it fails, that I thought I'd share here because I thought it was very relevant, even in some of the terminology that we use. So this first one here, which I like, around the difference in feedback and coaching and some of the ways it's being used. And I know some of those terms get thrown around, so if it helps clarify. Some feedback is evaluative. Your rating is a 4, and oftentimes feedback is often done in a performance evaluation setting. And some is coaching. Here's how you can improve. Everyone needs both. Evaluations tell where you stand, what to expect, and what is expected of you. Coaching allows you to learn and improve and helps you play at a higher level. So you will hear those terms being thrown around at Jump feedback coaching. I often get asked, what's the difference? I thought this is a relatively simple explanation. Obviously, it can merge. You can give feedback and then you move right into the coaching part. The other part I shared that I'm going to tee up a little bit, a session tomorrow is on analytics. And one of the neat parts about the feedback app is you can start to measure some of these things that largely hadn't been measured before. And one of the things that we've seen in our data for years is around this kind of notion that research has shown that those who explicitly seek critical feedback, that is, who are not fishing for praise, tend to get higher performance ratings. We've seen it in a more absolute sense. It's not actually just those who are seeking it, but even if they're not really seeking it, those that are giving it are receiving it. In the sense of they may not be actively seeking it, but if you can set up rituals where more people are seeking it and getting it, it's very correlated with performance. We've seen it in SAR. So a little tee up for tomorrow. You'll see more on the analytics side, which is pretty interesting. The other part I liked is when you ask for feedback, you not only find out how others see you, also influence how they see you. Soliciting constructive criticism communicates humility, respect, passion for excellence, and confidence all in one go. The reason I share this, I'm going to come back to touch on this, is oftentimes in the feedback conversation, a lot of the emphasis is on one of the levers, which is around giving feedback. how do we train our group? How do we train myself and to give feedback better? And actually there's a second lever, which is actually improving the skills to seek feedback. And so I'm going to touch on both. And lastly, which I'll touch on this, is it was very interesting, and I mentioned kind of the research. It was a question that came up here in the Boston Culture Tours about some of the research. And one of the parts that's very difficult on this, we got introduced to a woman, I think you got sent the feedback brief. Did you get sent the feedback brief as part of the packet? I think that was part of it. I don't know if you all read it, but that came from a woman studie who was a leading kind of grad student at Harvard, did a seminal study and a PhD study on feedback. And she had, before she got introduced to us, had looked at and gotten introduced to dozens of companies, hundreds of companies around this. And the hard part is most of the studies in organizations, feedbacks tend to be done in performance eval. That's where it ends up hooking in, or they're done behind closed doors, especially the critical. So she was having a very difficult time studying. She came in and studied that within NextShop for 6 months, and some of that reflection you saw in some of that in that feedback brief. So I'm gonna go, it's not working here. Mind just pressing it if it's not working? Okay. So why does building a culture of feedback fail? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. And so I'm going to give 2 examples. The first one is around fostering psychological safety is really difficult. And so Charlie shared a couple of examples today on Boeing. He shared an example in terms of the nuclear power plant. I want to share a similar example from an outcome standpoint, but for something that caught my eye that was a little bit different. So Amy Edmondson spoke at our vendors. I think we have a couple of people that came to that, and she talked about psychological safety. Charlie referenced her and the power of that and the absence of some of the costs. And one of the examples she shared was the Columbia Space Shuttle. It crashed in 2003. It was the 27th flight that they'd done. So by the 80s, it started to operationalize versus before you used to send the space shuttle up, and that was pretty much 1 or 2 times. And she shared the example. It crashed in 2003. It actually blew up upon reentry. And there was a congressional probing in it. And they spent literally, it was a year, multiple organizations took a look at this. And there was an engineer named Rodney who was, as she shared the story, he was on 60 Minutes, et cetera. And as she shared the story, this engineer, Rodney, noticed in the video up front, 16 days in the launch, was a gap between 16 days between the launch and the reentry. That there was it looked like there was a foam that had come off on the launch that hit part of the shuttle. And he thought and guessed there may be a problem with that. There might be a crack. And so he notices, he talked to his peer set. He ended up actually bringing it up to kind of his supervisor. And there was a meeting, a well-documented meeting, about 8 days before this, of where they got all the important people in a room. So in my head, I'm kind of thinking this is, I've been to a lot of military, briefings where you have the core table is like the senior leaders and like their version at NASA of the officers, and then the non-officers sitting around on the side. And in short, they had a whole discussion around the problems, exposing the problems that could go wrong, needed to get it on the table for anything that could happen, for the future. And the guy didn't speak up. And so in the probing afterwards, they asked him, like, why didn't he speak up? He knew this, and in fact, he'd even brought it up to his supervisor. And the first thing was like, they didn't really trust that the boss was really that, when they said, like, did they really have a culture that people could spoke up? And they talked about, not only did the boss say, the most senior person said, listen, we talk about all the time, speak up if you have a challenge. We ask you, you're required, lives are dependent on this. NASA is dependent on you speaking up for problems. And they asked the person that did it, and they said, is that true? And he said, absolutely. And in fact, in that meeting, the boss said, are there any problems? I want to hear them. And so they said, why didn't he not? And in short, he said, because I was like this, and the people in the room were like this. And there was a notion in there, in fact, when they dug into even the supervisor, it wasn't a black and white thing. The cost of going investigating this was millions and millions of dollars, would influence and take in the mission critical part a bunch of people to go in and do that work. And he was scared. He was scared of what the implications were. Would that make the boss look bad? It was messy. There's a gray area in there that he was brought up. So I say that, and I use that example, and it caught my attention. This is an organization that has high risk of failure, in the sense of I should say the cost of failure is exceptionally high. And in most organizations that have high cost of failure, they have stronger feedback systems. They have stronger investments in terms of their psychological safety. And even within this organization, even with this one, it's that difficult, including you at a boss. And so I would say that some of the punchline for this, they dug into it, it tended to be more willpower in their culture versus systematic and rituals. They didn't practice it. They didn't practice it across. The second piece of why it goes wrong is what I'll call the feedback aversion. And I'm calling it aversion that just from a human element, I talked about more of an organization element, but a human element we have. And so one of the things I like, this is from a woman who's actually really known for kind of her work on feedback. And she talks about humans are wired for learning and growth. And I think that's true. But we're also wired and have a desire to be accepted and loved for who we are. And that means there's a fundamental tension for all of us. When we receive candid feedback, in the moment, in the short run, it really challenges and threatens us. Do we feel a sense of belonging with this group, with this person? There was an individual, Jason Brown, he came to our June Academy as a CMC for a helicopter unit in the Navy, and he shared a leadership journey, which I'll do tomorrow, actually. But at the end of it, it was really powerful. But at the end of it, he talked about his experience at the Leadership Academy. And one of the things he talked about was, you'll go through it. He got feedback from next jumpers in his kind of, in one of his sessions. And he talked about how much he hated it. He was like, here are these people, some of them are like 21 to 24 years old. They're engineers, they don't know me. And all of a sudden they're basically judging me on like how I'm collaborating with people on my team. He's like, honestly, I was pissed. He used some even more choice language in that. He was pissed. But it was interesting. He said on the plane back and with his team, and he talked about his wife, he realized one thing that he realized here was how much he pulls his punches with people on his team. How in fact, he's like, they're here 21 to 25-year-olds don't even know me. They're practicing being direct. And I'm not direct with some of the people I'm responsible for. And then he went on and kind of shared that story. But I said that in the sense of this human aversion of feedback is very real and it makes us human. And to that notion, but yet we often lie, we LHF, I LHF, about our aversion to this. And one of the things I've seen in the work, and one of the things that I would say is the first step in building a stronger culture, is acknowledging the human side of our aversion to feedback and our challenges. And so here's just two things, and I don't know if you've heard of this. I've heard them from leaders across all disciplines because I've used them myself. Now I'm just in tune with it. One of them is, feedback doesn't bother me. Like, bring it on, right? Like I know others may not be able to handle it, but I can. They'll give a version of that. The second one is, I want to hear your feedback. And I'll show you in a second, because I'm going to replay back to your own surveys that you wrote into this and some of the language. But the implied part of I want to hear your feedback, if I really put the truth, for most people, maybe there's some higher level humans, but for most humans, on the receiving end, I want to hear your feedback, but I really want it to be good feedback. Or if it's critical feedback, I want it to be, I want you to that whole expression, we judge others on their actions, but we want to be judged on our intentions. Yeah, I want you to know all the intentions and kind of what went into it, and then I'll listen to your feedback. The other side of it is, I want to hear your feedback. Yeah, he probably wants to hear my feedback, but he really only wants to hear the good feedback. He doesn't really want to hear my feedback. That dialogue is going on from both sides of that equation. So if you're skeptical on that, I'm going to play back your own feedback aversion from your surveys. So to Charlie's point earlier, this isn't, I guess it could be fully transparent, so you see all of it. So I did cherry pick some, but the themes are across. I mean, you'd see it if you go through. There's almost no exceptions. And this is for this Leadership Academy, but these themes go across, this is probably our 15th Leadership Academy just on feedback alone. So I'm going to take a little bit of time on this. I realize it's a busy slide. But a few things. Again, this is in your survey. This is so the first one's on receiving. I have two slides, receiving and giving. So on the receiving side, no one wants to hear they messed up. I welcome any feedback so long as the person giving it understands that I do care and that I tried and gave my best effort. And I'm putting this up here because I actually love the survey response you got. It is human. It is real. And what you put is very authentic. And I think that's true. To the notion we want to be judged on our intentions. When I pour my best effort, yet is brashly criticized, 100%. That is hard. I feel like someone is attacking me rather than trying to help me out. I struggle with taking it too personal. I don't accept failure myself. I'll self-reflect harder on myself than initial feedback. Maybe I'll come back to that. That one's there are some individuals that are very hard on themselves. The one part, I guess, maybe I'd say, maybe I won't come back. I'll say this now. The one part on this is, Oftentimes in those is that for people that beat themselves up and hard, sometimes it makes it harder on others to give it because they don't want to add on to that. So there is a part of a human challenge on that to the giver. How to process. And so we talked on the LBR process earlier, but I want to put in some plain English here of what sometimes we often do. Sometimes I will stop listening. My mind will race about the feedback I'm receiving. Absolutely. And let me give an example. I'll go to the giving side. I have made a mistake for years when I'm giving candid feedback and I move right into the solution, right in the solution. But I'm not acknowledging, sometimes I'll stop listening. My mind will race about the feedback. I would argue that for us as humans, if you're not, you just haven't gotten enough candid feedback. When you're getting that feedback that's at the visceral level, that really is kind of, oh God, at the gut level, you do this. We all do this. I do this. And you're not there. Now you can train on all of this, but still it happens. Taking the emotion out of it and having a clear and open mind, I tend to overanalyze feedback. I hope that everyone can get there. I would challenge that oftentimes you're getting more visceral feedback. It's very difficult to take the emotion out of it. Reading between the lines. Pilots are often indirect in their feedback, not wanting to offend the captain. I'm assuming this came from a captain. And one of the parts that's a real challenge is, I think, as a senior leader, is you start to recognize and go with the senior leader is people are assuming like you're right just because you said it, you're right. And it's harder in many ways to kind of give feedback. They're worried about how they look. They're worried about the ramifications coming down. And so I think sometimes as a senior leader, we struggle in some ways if you really got to decipher and read between the lines. The temptation to compare my work performance to others, what Charlie referenced in the staying in your lanes. It's exceptionally difficult. And when you get feedback and you see somebody else's feedback, that can be difficult. I don't have a problem with feedback from upper leadership. I probably don't ask for feedback from junior enough. Exactly. I think this happens. Juniors, from peers, there are a variety of different reasons why this is, again, your words. Yet oftentimes, again, we'll walk around me like feedback doesn't bother me. It does, and especially when it's candid. So this is on the giving side. And I know these came up with some questions to Megan earlier too, after the 10X. Getting the point quickly. I feel like I need to beat around the bush. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Trying to find the right time to give feedback. Giving a layer of truth, but not the honest truth. We worked with Fidelity, one of the top asset management companies, and this is a very senior leader. Been very successful, come up through kind of the branches, and how he was trained, you would say, if I have to give somebody, basically that shit sandwich, we get trained in the shit sandwich, and basically would say, if I have to give someone more shit, I was trained, just pack on bigger loaves of bread on the either side of it. And there's an element of that gets at this thing here, is that if there's a kernel of honest truth, we have a very difficult time saying it. I want to shield my team from negative criticism. I don't want to be hated, but I also feel responsible if they underperformed. That gets at the essence of what that CMC was saying, right? I think one of the parts is reflection in the moment, right? He didn't want to attack the person's sense of belonging, feeling appreciated, feeling valued. But yet the long-term cost of it is they're not growing, they're underperforming, and that could have long-term consequences to them and to the team. And that's the tension. Sometimes things come out differently than what I meant to say. I can't say enough how often that one there is actually a reason why we don't say anything in that LHF. We don't say it because we're like, oh God, this isn't going to come out right. Or we may even not be mindful that like it's going to hurt their feelings. It may not even be that much, but we're like, it's not quite right what I'm saying. I haven't figured it out myself. We haven't done it. That notion of you have to have a solution, we have a problem. Sometimes we kind of, we don't know what the solution is. We don't know the coaching advice. So we use tips, things like NQRs. I may not know how to solve that, but that NQR is an example of, which gets at this thing. I may not know the solution, but I know that something's not quite right. So, and you can be able to train that within a culture. I struggle with finding the words to do it in a way that supports a person, can support change. So these are very good examples, I thought, in your words, of the fundamental challenge to why, is it any surprise when you have people in the feedback receiving, when you have experiences of that emotionally, and as a giver, you also have this in your head, why there's a feedback aversion within any conversations. You call them within senior leadership, within your peer set, within your boss, within others. It's normal. And I think a mistake we make is we go in and now talk about to your teams, talk about it to your peer sets, for yourself, is that, and I'm in the guiltiest of this, is that we move on and don't recognize there is a human element to that. This is very difficult. The good news on that is we're not alone. The bad news, and I guess the other good news, is that you can train for it to get better at both sides. The bad news is if you don't talk about it. Okay. One last thing I'll put on this part is, if it helps, sometimes I think it helps to identify where some of the triggers in the receiving come from, right? So one of the triggers is around truth. And what I mean by truth, and I'll give just an example for myself. I got feedback on Monday night from Charlie and Megan on an assumption they were making and feedback about Tom and I. Directionally, it was accurate, but they were making some assumptions they didn't fully know, and my immediate reaction is like, oh, that's not quite true. There were parts in that thing that were not quite true, right? And so one of my reactions, one of my triggers is that if the feedback's not fully true, then I will glom on and react to the parts that are not true, to the point where sometimes, and I've done this many times, that ultimately people are like, oh, Greg's way too just hard to give feedback to. If I don't get it perfectly, he's just not going to listen. So just recognize that that's a trigger. Another one's a relationship, more upset about who gave us the feedback than what was said. So I'll just, again, we ran a Super Saturday. It's our recruiting event. We just had one this past Saturday. And it didn't happen this time, but it certainly happened to me before. We run part of the event, and I can get feedback, say, from Tom, and it could be a point, and I'm like, oh, this is great, good. And I can get, like, a 22-year-old's in their first year, hasn't even done a full recruiting season, and gives me that feedback. And my honest reaction is like, come back to me after you've done recruiting for about 4 years and give me that feedback, right? And that's my honest reaction. And you react to that. I mean, who doesn't? And it's somewhat painful, but there's a kernel in there that's a data point that I can easily shut down or dismiss. Another one is identity. It causes us to self-doubt ourselves. This is a bad one. So it's like, I'm already feeling guilty or bad about something I've done. Then the feedback comes and it just shuts me down, right? Or it shuts me down, or I just start fighting it, because at the end of it, I'm like guilty or whatever it is about what I'm working on. And then fear of implications that the feedback might do to hurt our image or career. So I share those in the sense of none of them are bad. This goes back to the human element. These triggers, and just understand the triggers, they've helped me. Hopefully, maybe they'll help some of you, of just understanding where they come from, because understanding them, I think, can help you in some ways, I think, practice faster on ways to train, to recognize them in that take a break and resiliency part, to come back stronger and recognize the goal of it. I love for those of you who are familiar with Brené Brown, she talks on kind of the power of vulnerability. One of the things that she touches on that I really love is she talks on is giving direct feedback is very, very difficult. The onus is on the receiver of feedback to find the nuggets of gold within it, right? So these are triggers that stop us from finding our gold. Okay. I'm going to shift over to the principles of feedback system and some of the kind of the how. This is a busy slide, so I'm going to go quickly through it. You'll have, and I'm only going to deep dive into a little bit more into a couple of them. So we touched on this of the principles to dial up versus dial down. And so there's a lot of research, 20th century feedback systems versus 21st century. I've done that slide. I've gone in more detail. I'm using it a little bit. I'm trying to use a little bit more plain English here. The first one, which we touched on earlier, the exposed problems versus hiding problems. But again, oftentimes problems are discussed behind closed doors. That's a very standard part. The more you can expose problems, make it transparent. Again, this notion of only when problems are known can we work on them. High expectations versus low expectations. And again, this is a dial. There is a dial between appreciative versus, and so we think about, you'll see Cornitas on the last day we have, that's more of our appreciation, kind of our gratitude feedback. We have a very specific ritual for that. But when a group or a culture over indexes on, I think in the Navy or military, maybe they call it BZ type feedback. When you over index it, the unintended consequences of that is that you can't get better. And you'll see a little bit more in the metrics and the analysis. You can actually start to measure this in some of the feedback app. It's been actually very interesting. But our intentions are good. We want to tell the person, you're appreciated, you're valued, you're part of this group. But if it's too much in that direction, the unintended consequences are that we don't think you can better. You're good enough the way you are, even though that's not our intentions. Timely versus delayed. So again, in most traditional organizations, sometimes feedback is only given during the performance evals once a year. And so, how do you do it more, timely, practice it more? If you're running a marathon, you probably don't want to just go to one practice right before then run 20 miles. You got to build up. It's the same thing in anything, and feedback's certainly no different. Everyone has a voice versus few have a voice. And the other one I touched on before is this emphasis on seeking feedback and dialing down the emphasis on giving feedback. Both of them are important. I just find that organizations and individuals will often over-index on, you got to get the giving feedback right, and if you over-index on that, not only do you not make it easy seeking feedback is actually a lever to make it easier to give feedback, so you can train on that. But you also, I've seen almost like a death spiral. The more you emphasize giving feedback, people get more in their head of, oh God, until I'm like good at giving feedback, I'm just not going to give it. So it's a dial. And the last part I'll say is this: A systems require an emphasis on rituals and setup. Going back to the NASA part, going back to what we're talking about, we'll end this a little bit with what are the rituals and the setup, and we're going to spend a lot more time on Friday giving you the opportunity within your group on some of this implementation and think about it. So going to the seeking feedback, here's one part, and I've shared this before. I love it personally, so I have this up on my wall. But even within close circles, so talk about not the junior and senior, even within my closest team with Tom, for instance, who we know each other very, very well. I think this question is so helpful of what am I doing to make it difficult for my teammate to tell me the truth and fast? And I think being able to think about that, and I encourage you maybe over the next few days and beyond to think about that in this setting, within your closest peer set even. What are you doing to make it difficult for your teammates to tell the truth? And there are two levers. The other one, it came out in a survey, I didn't mention in there, but it was this is around giving feedback, but they must have either are familiar with the term, a kind of radical candor. There's a woman, Kim Scott, she was at Google, and she's been quite a lot of research in other parts of this notion of radical candor, which I 90% really love, and so that with a few differences. So the way she thought about it is very simply, is when you give people feedback, or in this kind of candor, there are two elements you can look at. Are you giving it directly, and are you giving it with empathy? And so she puts in there, she calls it radical candor, is the combination of giving it directly, giving direct feedback with empathy. And that I think is understood. I think a desired outcome that we have in the way we communicate with individuals. The least desired outcome is this manipulative insincerity. So you're not giving, it's not direct, and there's no empathy. And then she labels it 2 and 3. So she says, if it's better actually to be, and research has shown, it's better to actually be obnoxiously aggressive than it is actually to be number 3, which is out direct. And the one caveat I'll put on this is that I think I've come to appreciate over time. I think we've talked about this internally as well, is that actually there are only 2 zones. And those zones are 1 and 4. And what I mean, especially as you improve your own culture of feedback, that 2 and 3, rudeness, empathy, and obnoxious aggression, are temporary zones. They're not permanent. And what I mean by that is, if you're obnoxiously aggressive, you give feedback too difficult, especially if you have a culture of feedback where people can speak up, you'll get feedback on that you're giving it over the line or it's too much. And I've certainly experienced that. I mean, my tendency would be more in the 2. And there's parts when you're practicing it, giving permission within your community, within your team to do this is going to be important. But if you give feedback on the feedback, you'll end up in 1. But here's the reverse. If you're empathetic without being direct, over time, people lose trust in you. Over time, people recognize what Charlie was talking about, the eggshells, the lying, hiding, faking, what's not being said in this. Trust goes down, and at some point, it becomes manipulative insincerity. The other part I'll add in changing her is, in practice, this all sounds good. Start with work on being more direct and then adding empathy. Great. I find, though, in practice, the first step is actually start with authenticity. And there's some tips on this. And so what I mean by this is, if I'm a people pleaser, right, and I struggle with giving people direct feedback in conversations, if I go and say work on being more direct first, that's a tall order. So we just have little crutch phrases, little tips here. So for instance, you can just say, this might be one of the things, Megan does this really well. This might be hard for you to hear, but this is uncomfortable for me to say, but. And that is a more effective way. First off, it's authentic. You are feeling uncomfortable. So just stating your authenticity for that and those things, much better than I'm feeling uncomfortable about giving you direct feedback. So I'm going to pack in a bunch of bread, talk about the 3 to 4, 5 things you're good at. Then I'm going to give you what I'd like to say. And then I'm going to give you 3 to 4 to 5 more really good things about you because I'm uncomfortable. Here's the hard part about as a messenger. As a messenger, you're now starting with the bigger the shit sandwich. It's becoming ruinous empty. What are you trying to tell me? Am I good? Am I bad? Am I good? You just told me a lot of good things now, and you kind of told me about, I'm not sure what to make. So that notion of start with authenticity, like whatever you're feeling, if you're a people pleaser, if you're being more direct, sometimes what I'll say, because I'm more on the direct, I generally don't worry as much on what people may say. But what I am worried though is sometimes is like, I don't want to come off like an asshole. So I may say like, I realize it's being direct and I'm sorry if I'm not getting the words right, but, and then I'll say it. So again, if that's helpful. So now I'm going to move into kind of how to get started, this kind of 2% change, and then we'll open up for some questions. So again, this is a little bit hard to read in kind of slide form, but using this kind of part here of the team one, the different conversations, we recommend that phase 1 is reducing organizational silence. Ultimately, you want to work on both. But if the foundation at the junior to senior, people are afraid to speak up, and the senior relationship is what we call LHF, not authentic, they're not speaking openly, the 2 things are going to happen. The foundation of training and having collaboration on the team below it and be able to train them to be better decision makers, more resilient, give better feedback is not going to work very well. So that notion of conversation number 2, what we call turning on the community voice, getting team 2 to be authentic about the problems they are observing, turning on this kind of human sensor part in a better way, improving what you already have. The conversation number 3, resiliency of leaders, training leadership teams to have more honest conversations, improve sense making. Charlie touched on today in terms of in more depth of some recommendations on that conversation number 3. So I'm not going to cover that here. So now I'm going to cover a bit more depth in terms of conversation number 2 and what some of the approaches. I'm going to give you some examples. And again, I'm mindful here, this isn't instructions. And I'm mindful that one of the parts I thought Charlie said really well that I get myself in trouble is to actually execute something. There are a lot of nuances. And one of the things, even in the Navy, I'll just use them as an example, is that when we say, I reference the 2%, I probably should have explained that. The 2% is that any organization, any organism, it shows up in research, it shows up in science, that if you try to change more than 2% at any one time, it fails. So if you change 2%, organizations can take that on, teams can take that. If it's more than that, they tend to reject it. So within that 2%, if you think about a battle rhythm in work, say it's a 50-hour work week, just to make the math easy, that's about 1 hour a week that you could change. So, given that, that's what I was kind of thinking on. So in terms of this upgraded conversation number 2, the kind of the how-to is bringing in-house, exposing problems transparently, right? So a couple things in this that we recommend and have seen is, the first one is inventory your current process. So different communities may have in say the Navy, different teams might have different processes, and they might have a stronger versus less strong kind of conversation number 2. It might be more candid versus less, depending on things. So for example, there are external ones we've spoken on, Glassdoor, Reddit. There may be kind of these tools that are used kind of internally, but that senior leadership is not aware of. So again, that could be, WhatsApp. Other versions, maybe Slack is being used internally and the senior leadership's not aware of it. There are a variety of tools, which I won't go more into what Charlie said, but very well said. The amount of tools and places that basically that team 2, the junior team, has to communicate with themselves is instant, and it's happening, and we often don't know it. Then there are other parts that are internal tools. So again, I'm using more Navy examples, but they have surveys. They have the climate assessment survey, the DEOX. They have maintenance and safety surveys. They have a CO suggestion box. They speak up in meetings. That's one thing when we do it too. Speak up in meetings. What do you have to say? Management by walking around. There are lots of ways that you do this from an inventory standpoint that we get at what is the feedback that we're hearing, what's going on. Just to share a little bit of where some of and we've spoken on them some, where some of these are what I'll challenge of ways it could be improved. Some of them are time late. So for instance, in some of the kind of engagement surveys or the climate surveys, they tend to be once a year, maybe twice a year. They tend to be later. They tend to be, in fact, a couple months or at least a month plus after even the initial survey was given. Things such as even in terms of CO suggestion box, sometimes those suggestion box can be sitting there and you can get some, but maybe a month later before they're necessarily read. The second one is transparency. A lot of them can be cherry picked. It's very willpower. It's up to the senior leader to choose what parts they're going to share with the team. So oftentimes if somebody gives a feedback in session, they see others up there and theirs wasn't there, it does make them wonder what else is not being shared by the senior leadership team. And so it actually, even though you're thinking you're doing and building trust, I wouldn't underestimate there's elements that you're just, and our intentions may be good. That was a feedback said really poorly, but again, it can hurt the trust. And then management, speak up in meetings, management while walking around. Charlie references as well. Sometimes we ensue the same 5 or 6 people that speak up, we assume are the ones speaking for everybody. And so we can have biases and blind spots on that. And we're also assuming that what they're saying to our face is actually what they really want to say. And I've learned that firsthand, is a big assumption. It's not to say that any of this is what's happening isn't, you should keep. I'm just saying inventory what you have. Then there's some certain rituals that we talk about in terms of both from a jump start as well as sustainment that you can bake in. So I'm giving some examples. I go into more details. The what's working, what's not, you're about to do this probably in about 20 minutes or so, is a jump start. You do that in a more intense ways, every 6 months, every year. And there's value there, kind of what Charlie touched on, of really getting out some of those kind of core issues within a group. It's been very effective across all types of teams. And all types of situations. And then sustainment. So even things in your weekly battle rhythms, you might have places where you have feedback at the end of it, maybe ask for hand raising. There are ways to do it where you can make it more transparent. So I think in an academy here, some of the feedback wall, for instance, you've seen, I'll get into that. The feedback app is certainly one of it. You can use technology for it. On my minds in meetings, I don't think I have a slide on this, but I found it very effective where if I start a meeting, say it's 10 to 12 people, oftentimes I may go in with my own agenda. I have an agenda of what I want to cover. Even pausing and going around and asking people what's in their mind for 2 minutes, 30 seconds, even slows down. And sometimes it allows me to adjust on things that are in the mind before. Once a senior person starts with their agenda and here's where we're going to go, I mean, you're making it now more difficult for people to actually speak up. So little things like that we bake into internally for here at Next Jump in some of our team meetings as well. So I'm going to go into a bit more depth. So what's working, what's not? And again, I'm teeing up a little bit this current conversation of what you're about to do. But the example you're using is actually with a VAW unit. So that's an aviation unit of a leader that came to, I think, the November Academy of last year. And we ran this exercise with his leadership team to his junior sailors. So I've seen it being used at the wing level, at the top level, at the senior level, but it can be used for full teams. In this case, is the junior sailors. And so the way you do this exercise is you start with what's working, you start with what's not working, and you just brainstorm with the group. And any idea is a good idea. There's no arguing. You just list it up, right? And ideally, there's you'll see it yourself, there's some pace to going through this. And ideally, it's about the team or whatever group that you're in. Then you pause and you go and you do what's not working, right? So the what's not working is and again, same thing. Everyone goes around, no bad answers, no bad ones, you put that up there. What you find is that people have pet issues, will state their pet issues, but other issues come out. Everybody gets 3 green stickers and 3 red stickers. And so each of you will go through and you'll say, all right, if I'm the leader of this group, if we invest in the areas of what's not working, in the what's working, for instance, you put your green stickers. If you were the CEO, where would you put your energy investment to make us do better as a group? The greatest return for the effort. And the same thing on the what's not working. You are now the head of this group. If you were the head of this group, what would you address as a critical problem to have the greatest return for the group? The beautiful part on this is it's collective intuition. So you can see everyone, the loudest person in the room doesn't have 10 stickers. The quietest person in the room doesn't have 0 stickers. Everyone has 3 red, 3 green. Very quickly, you can see the power of this intuition. The next thing that they did that was crucial is afterwards, they brainstormed, they talked about it. But what Guillermo did and what we recommend is that he made it transparent in the group. What I mean by that is the entire group. And so he left this up on the wall. So you can see here what's working. So things like CEO transparency, time off. They like their Saturdays off. They'd done things, they were very real. And you see some of those, hands-on supervisors, flexibility in the working center. There were other pages I haven't included here. But then on the that's not working, bite off more than we can chew, too much maintenance, short period. They put up sexism. They put up, procrastination, laziness. These are things that they were tough topics. Racism came up there. These were tough topics in a group. And they didn't solve it in that right afterwards. They were shocked. The junior sailors were shocked that the leadership left this transparent for everyone in the group. Not only did they leave it for everyone in the group, they were within a wing that other wings could come through and see it, and it fostered a whole slew of conversations. Not that dissimilar in the NBA ref side to an extent. They just showed where some of the issues were. And just sometimes a combination of the transparency and the leadership willing to have the transparency is a group able to start chipping away and working on some things. And again, these are very tough. That was a really, really good way that the leadership jump-started some of these topics. So other parts, this feedback wall, so here's ones that again, you can do this without technology. So one of the questions is the best, I think, kind of system you create is 90% human, 10% technology. And in some of the cases, especially within the Navy, they're on ships and maybe in subs, you can't use it. We worked with the USS Michael Mansour as one of the first Zumwalt destroyers. So, and they had a whole slew of complexity in their system of less sailors. They had more networking, they had other things. They had to build a different culture. And I thought one of the most powerful rituals that they brought into place was they called it a problem wall, same concept. And anyone during the course of that week could go up and write, without signing their name, you could put the name, you didn't have to, put up a problem that was going on in the ship at that point. Anybody did. And they had once a week, the triad came down with some of the department heads, they reviewed the wall, they talked about it, and they would invite anybody on the ship that wanted to come, and they'd address their point of view about some of the problems, and maybe ask some questions, dig into it. It was the fact that people could go up and expose the problems, and the fact that leadership was acknowledging the problems and having an open conversation. It was a very effective way to start exposing it. So I'm going to touch on the seeking feedback. And so I used the example before of, a common thing that I hear, and I've seen leaders do this, I've done this, is I want to hear your feedback. They'll end this meeting. I want to hear your feedback. I want to hear your feedback about this presentation. And it's well-intentioned, but it's not very effective for all the reasons, the feedback aversion. So here's an example of a ritual that we use. You saw this in 10X, but even in our staff meetings, for instance, one of the things we do is we have what's called buzz. So it's a part of our staff meeting where we take a junior or more junior next jumper, and they train on their presentation skills, and they talk about kind of what's going on qualitatively within the organization, not our numbers, et cetera. And there's a rotation. So you speak in the front of the company about 4 to 5 times, and they get feedback on their presentation skills. So one thing you could do is this person is getting feedback on their presentation skills. They ask for, I want feedback on my presentation skills. This is just the starting slide that they do before they give their buzz. And it says, why do I want to be a great public speaker? What is my desired outcome? Then what cripple, and they go into it, have the confidence to speak up, communicate with influencers. This is a woman that's in their customer experience team. She wants to be a better leader and better communicator within her customer experience team. And then she talks about what cripples her effectiveness: fear of judgment, not concise, fear of letting others down, overly anxious. It shows in practice, it shows in research that for Rosie here, if you go and self-assess first, it's something order of magnitude like 5 times more likely to actually, whatever feedback you get, to take it on and make changes. But it's also sending a powerful signal to the audience that, okay, if I'm a people pleaser, I don't want to have a Rosie. That's tough going up in front of the whole company. It's like, gosh, it's tough to give her feedback from others. I don't want her to look bad. This is just baked in the ritual. You don't have a choice of going up and doing buzz without this. But now it feels, I know where Rosie wants to go. I know what she wants is her desired outcome. And it's not just this presentation. It's she wants to be a better speaker, a better communication as a leader within her group. And she's talking about what I'm not very good at right now. It makes it a lot easier for the team to give feedback. So I find in leaders, I'll give you an example just using this right here, is I could say at the end of this, I want your feedback. Now, going back to the feedback version, there's a part of me that doesn't really want this feedback, so I can, acknowledge that. But here's the other part. There's an element of, we're working with so many teams across the Navy, other organizations, and being able to start principles where they get into action. To Charlie's point, they don't just leave here and be like, oh, I'd really like to do this, and they don't do anything. Ultimately, the desired outcome is helping organizations have more candid conversations, upgrade their individuals, their people, upgrade their leaders. And this is one method to this. That's the desired outcome I want. So what cripples this is there's an element of, I often pack way too much in presentations. I have a very difficult time simplifying. I could talk on this thing for hours. On top of this, oftentimes people want the instructions on what to go get started. And oftentimes I like to give them the instructions on what to go started, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the desired outcome. So with that, I know you'll leave the feedback on the feedback wall, but again, you can evaluate yourself, but that would be a different way in many ways, in some ways, to engage as a leader or engage as a person kind of, seeking feedback is a different way than just saying, I want your feedback. It puts a lot of pressure on the giving, and it makes me actually feel less, now once I frame that, I feel less nervous about getting your critical feedback. So I'm going to end with this slide. I believe this is my last slide. Here's another one of sharing a difficult problem. And so we were at a helicopter unit, and they use, and I think this is not unique to them, it's across certainly aviation, I think other parts. They have an expression called a head herder. And a head herder they use, and I think they could probably use it more structured, but a head herder is a very difficult problem that particular team is facing, that particular group is facing, and they put it on the table. This is also a very effective way to seek feedback. And what it represents really is a difficult problem the team's facing. So in this case here, I think it's fine. They have a new kind of helicopter it's kind of like with the Fire Scout that is with the drone. So I'm assuming since we were there, it's not top secret. But it's creating a lot of operational challenges for the team. It's both exciting because it's a new kind of initiative that they're doing, but it's also creating a huge operational burden, and it's a flashpoint for this unit. So the maintenance officer went up, and I thought did a very effective job. It wasn't even a presentation, just talked about why it was important to them, why he was excited about it, and all the challenges and what they're doing about it. And it got some of the most effective feedback I've seen within a unit. It was awesome. In like 5 minutes, it was littered with really quality feedback, which again, you probably can't read it here. And it doesn't even fully matter, but very nuanced about the work, about problems and what they may not be seeing. Blind spots that the maintenance officer might not be seeing. Some of it he probably knew, some of it he may not have. But then they also did get feedback that was probably made his blood boil a little bit around feedback that was like, you said too many ums, you seemed a bit arrogant. There is a notion of I don't know if that's true or not. That was not my perception. I don't know him very well. But regardless, point being is that there is an element of which we'll get into later on of, as you get more transparency, there is some good parts to here. We've seen it in the commands, but it also brings this element around of which probably really frustrated. I've been there. Which is why in our notion, we combine these two of working on conversation 2 and conversation 3. As you work as a senior leadership team to improve the transparency and the voice of your sailors, in this case for Navy, your team within other groups, the strength of your leadership team, the strength of the team around you, the authenticity to be able to process this also needs to strengthen as well. So with that said, I'll leave with this. Everyone likes a good quote, but I love this of Nick Saban's. He's probably one of the most successful college coaches. He coaches Alabama. Many people hate Alabama, but still, he's an amazing coach. And I love this quote. It really resonates with me. If average players want to be left alone, good players want to be coached, great players want to be told the truth. And I think there's an element around that of creating a system where first the truth, and then you add in the coaching. You do need both. But be able to kind of think about those as distinct levers and think about the distinct levers of the seeking and giving feedback, I think will really help you as you go out and improve kind of your culture of feedback. That's all I have. Maybe we'll take about 10 minutes, do some questions, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and you'll do your version of the what's working, what's not. So let's start in Boston, and then maybe Daryl, someone can help out in New York too with kind of going around. But first one in Boston here.
Thank you. Tommy Shannon, U.S. Navy, Jacksonville, Florida. We were chatting earlier here at the table just in reference to the paper feedback forms, and it caught our eye that we weren't putting our own names on those forms. So we're wondering, when should feedback be left anonymous, and when should it have a name, face, identity attached to it, and why?
Yep. No, it's a great question. So I'll give you an example of how we do both. In the day-to-day feedback around kind of the Pulse one, we recommend leaving it anonymous. And the reason we do that is there's so many barriers of terms of with names of like, oh, they said this, et cetera. So it provides psychological safety with the not the names, and you'll get more candidness. Now, having said that, I'll give you some examples where we have a leadership selection, what we call a leadership group called MV21. So it's our kind of senior leadership team, and we're unique. We get feedback from everybody. That decision is crucially important in terms of, and so we want the feedback from others about this, but the who matters, the who really matters in terms of who they're recommending, and because people have agendas of they may want their leader versus others, or and so in that's an example of a place where we do get a survey. We get this back. We want to hear what people say, but we also want to be able to follow up and have a dialogue in what they're saying and and the who is really matters in terms of, because that decision's so important. So when we often find if the decision's important kind of, and really what to do, there's a part around, having the name, et cetera, is important. So for instance, when we were in our staff meeting, for instance, and I may be giving an update about my part of the business to everybody, right? In that case there, someone that's not on my team, that doesn't really know me, we have a really difficult time. So it's helpful to get that team two kind of feedback, and anonymous helps a lot. But when I'm going and kind of getting feedback of those kind of in the arena and closest to that, I'm getting the feedback in the sense of, either in person, or I'm going to have them send me emails of which the name's important.
I think about it as Tom speaking, that it's how close to the actual decision it is. So for example, for evals, so your annual evaluation, like you're gonna get promoted and raises, like, that should not be anonymous. You want to know who's actually saying that, your boss, and what's being said. But if it's data points, if it's being treated as a data point, and part of a larger, system to make a decision, like getting weekly feedback, that's better anonymous, because you're getting, more visceral, more truth. People that would be maybe afraid to speak up are actually giving you their honest opinion. But if it comes at the end of the day, we're doing serious stuff. When it comes down to a decision point, people are responsible.
New York?
Any questions in New York?
We got one, Greg.
Hey, good afternoon, sir. So my question is, our squadron's been using the app for a number of months now. One of the things we've had some pretty honest feedback. If the whole goal of this is to receive feedback and then be able to respond to it in an effective way, why is there a certain reason why the app doesn't allow like a leader who is receiving feedback to respond to that feedback?
Yeah, and for a couple different reasons. One is, and you'll notice even in our rituals that we create, to try to give some space of capturing the data point and not having the receiver respond. So even in 10X, for instance, when they went, there was an element of, you probably noticed, they couldn't like debate the people giving them feedback. And I think there is a time and place to kind of just let the data points lie without engaging back for the receiver. Then it gets into the acknowledgement, and actually acknowledging feedback, there takes some discernment, and there's an absolute place for it. We found that the best place isn't actually the app itself. So for instance, and I give an example, that VAW unit was another example that did it, but Admiral Burke, so now the VCNO, but when he launched it within kind of the N1, one of the first things he did was he got very difficult feedback. I mean, there was a specific topic around work life, and it just was a flashpoint. So they got very kind of candid feedback. Some said well, some not said that well. And I did not speak to him on this. My understanding was he probably had his own feedback aversion moment. And he ended up acknowledging it back in an email that was thought out. It was kind of run by his kind of senior team. And it was well thought out, but it acknowledged the feedback, and he restated his intention and the thinking around that, and acknowledging there were some differences. And so in the app itself, we found that if you did that, you'd be more likely to do it in the reactive moment. So now it's like emotional, and boom, now all of a sudden there's a whole conversation that, that makes that data point even bigger. So it's not to say that the data points that come up should not be acknowledged. I think oftentimes they should. Some cases you don't. And in fact, you'll get into a little bit more on the feedback app tomorrow on that part. But the feedback app also has a community aspect, so they can kind of, and so allowing the community, sometimes things are said inappropriately or not a good thing, and the boss didn't have to respond. Actually, the community is responding, and that actually wasn't that helpful. In which case, actually, then the leader may not need to. So anyway, long-winded answer, but that's the reason why it's not in the app itself.
Greg, got another question here in New York.
Okay.
So you've had a lot of people come through your leadership academies that are from nonprofit fields, and I think this also relates to entrepreneurs. We rely a lot on volunteers, people to give us work for free, do what they can. So I think we can be hesitant to give feedback, especially when there's no monetary value assigned to the job. They're just doing it from the good of their hearts. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how to navigate that space?
Yeah. So I think my wife is a career nonprofiter, so I understand the challenges. And oftentimes I think where you're getting at too is that you're so grateful for kind of resources and help that you don't want that. It goes back to that feedback. The tension is you certainly don't want them to leave. So you're like, I'm just going to give you grateful element. So the best kind of recommendation I'd give is to acknowledge it with people. And I think there is a part of, I would argue, and I've seen actually with some nonprofits and certainly entrepreneurs, is that it's actually a bad narrative that you can't give them growth feedback, that you just have to be appreciative. And in fact, I think one of the elements that you can do is actually invest in ways little to small. So if they're, maybe the full-timers, you'd want to invest more in than just the kind of the part-time volunteers. But regardless of this, is your intention is they will be better people for their experience at your nonprofit, which may require times to have more candid feedback with the intention that you have high expectations for them to grow into. And so again, I think you start with a smaller circle on that, maybe your people on your staff before you necessarily go to volunteers, but point being is I think that mindset, you can do both, but just recognize the fear you're referencing is the fear irrespective of nonprofits or entrepreneurs. One last one in Boston.
Hi. So I feel like a lot of the examples that have been shared today have kind of been focused around maybe a business problem or a decision or a strategy. And I'm wondering how an approach to feedback, both giving and receiving, needs to change when it's a personal problem, like somebody's behavior in a meeting or behavior in an interaction.
Yep. So what I'd say with this is the goal of it is there is no difference. And the goal of it is that the desired outcome is it same thing with a person. You need it to get better, but yet it struggles. So it just makes it more challenging. The feedback aversion is easier when it's like on something else versus yourself. So just recognize that the desired outcome is the same. And to this notion that the more, the people I have my own biases and blind spots. I'll share my journey tomorrow. And so if I'm not getting feedback or kind of push on my own bias or blind spots, in fact, as I increase responsibility and accountability for others and have a bigger seat to have a bigger impact on the business, I am impacting the business by not working on my own biases and blind spots. So now having said that, what I would recommend in the starting point here too is you build this, the goal is to get to training your team, training your next level, bring in some of the parts at scale, not only in their feedback giving, but their ability to self-assess. That is the goal, but start with the leadership, right? If that can come back up to you as like the leader, you'll give you'll know how to do it better, but you'll also be able to coach it better in others.
Yeah, it's been our experience. We've seen it in other organizations. There's a natural evolution of starting with feedback on the work. How do we do collectively? We want to get the mission done, whatever that mission is. How do we get better at that? But the reality is, at the root cause of almost everything boils down to a people issue. Especially you work with the same people over time. We all have our repeated issues. I do the same annoying things that I've been doing for years. I still do them. The cool part is as the feedback culture of a team evolves and people get more practice saying difficult things, it it naturally goes to that point where people start bringing up like, you know what, like this is the real reason why this thing went off the rails, because you're over aggressive again, you're too quiet, Tom, again. And that's, but it's a workup to get there.
And that what Charlie and Megan touched on earlier today on that conversation 3, that conversation, the difficult conversations within your smaller leadership group, that's the part I would practice more in the person part first than in a big public setting.
Thank you.
All right, so Tom and I will be around certainly here to answer any questions, but I welcome your feedback now on the feedback wall, and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll go into the what's working, what's not.